A chance encounter. Jerome sat in the dimly lit bar, nursing a whiskey on the rocks, his mind wandering after another long day at work. The hum of conversations and the clinking of glasses around him were a comforting backdrop to his solitude. Life had been predictable for him. Steady job, small but decent apartment, and a group of friends he could count on for a good time. He wasn't looking for anything serious, especially not in the romantic department. His last relationship had ended messily, and he had sworn to himself that he'd avoid the complications of love and commitment for as long as he could. He glanced around the bar, watching people socialize, laughing, flirting, lost in their own little worlds. That's when he noticed her. She was sitting at the bar, alone, a glass of wine in her hand, her eyes scanning the room just as his had been moments ago. She was striking, perhaps a bit older than him, but with a confident, magnetic presence. Her long, auburn hair fell in waves down her shoulders, and her sharp dark eyes seemed to pierce through the dim lighting of the bar. She caught him looking at her, and instead of averting her gaze, she smiled. Jerome felt a slight jolt in his chest, a mix of intrigue and caution. He wasn't in the mood for anything more than a casual night out, but something about her drew him in. Before he knew it, he found himself standing next to her at the bar, ordering another drink. "Care for some company?" he asked, casually leaning against the counter, trying to sound nonchalant. She smiled again, this time wider. "That depends on whether you're interesting enough to keep my attention," she replied, her voice low and smooth. Jerome chuckled. "I'll try my best." Her name was Maria, and conversation flowed easily between them. She had a sharp wit, a little sarcasm in her humor, and there was something alluring about her confidence. As they talked, Jerome found himself growing more comfortable, more intrigued. They spoke about everything: life, work, their favorite music, places they wanted to travel. The hours passed quickly, and soon enough, the bar began to empty, but neither of them seemed eager to leave. As the night went on, the connection between them deepened, though it remained light, playful. They both agreed that neither was looking for anything serious. Maria was up front. She liked her independence, she enjoyed the freedom of being single, and she had no desire to settle down anytime soon. Jerome echoed her sentiments, relieved that they were on the same page. When the time came to leave, Maria leaned in closer, her lips brushing against Jerome's ear as she whispered, "Why don't you come back to my place? No strings attached, of course." Jerome hesitated for only a second. He wasn't the type to do this, hooking up with someone he had just met. But the temptation was strong, and in that moment, he convinced himself that it was harmless fun, a distraction from the monotony of his usual routine. After all, she had made it clear that this was nothing serious, just a fleeting encounter. They left the bar together, walking through the cool night air toward her apartment. Jerome's mind buzzed with excitement, the anticipation of something new and spontaneous. It had been a long time since he had felt this kind of thrill. Maria's hand found his as they walked, and he felt a strange sense of ease despite the unknown that lay ahead. Her apartment was small but tastefully decorated, with art on the walls and soft lighting that made the space feel warm and intimate. She poured them both a glass of wine, and before long, they found themselves wrapped up in each other, the night unfolding as they had both expected. It was passionate, electric, and fleeting, just as they had agreed it would be. As the sun began to rise, Jerome dressed quietly, not wanting to wake Maria, who was still asleep next to him. He left a note on her bedside table, something polite but non-committal. He wasn't the type to vanish without a word, but he also didn't want to leave any room for misinterpretation. This had been a fun night, nothing more. The weeks that followed were a return to normalcy for Jerome. He didn't think much about Maria after that night, chalking it up as just another encounter in the single life he had chosen for himself. Work picked up, and he threw himself into his projects, occasionally meeting up with friends for drinks or casual dates with women who, like him, weren't looking for anything serious. Life was simple again, just the way he liked it. But then, one afternoon, as Jerome was sitting in his office, his phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "We need to talk. It's Maria." Jerome frowned, a knot forming in his stomach. He hadn't expected to hear from her again, especially not with a message that sounded so ominous. He tried to brush it off, thinking that maybe she just wanted to catch up, but something about the tone of the message nagged at him. Later that evening, they met at a small cafe near his apartment. Maria was already seated when he arrived, her face unreadable. Jerome sat down across from her, a nervous energy buzzing in the air. "Maria, what's going on? Is everything okay?" he asked, trying to keep his tone light. Maria looked down at her coffee for a moment before meeting his eyes. "I'm pregnant," she said, her voice steady, but filled with an emotion he couldn't quite place. Jerome's world tilted. His heart thudded loudly in his chest, and for a moment, he wasn't sure he had heard her correctly. "What?" he whispered, his mouth dry. Maria leaned forward, her expression soft, but resolute. "I'm keeping the baby, Jerome." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and unshakable. Jerome felt like he had been punched in the gut. This wasn't what he had signed up for. This wasn't part of the plan. He had made it clear that night. They both had. That this was just a fling, no strings attached. But now, it seemed, those strings had tangled around him, pulling him into something he wasn't prepared for. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Maria continued, her voice calm but firm. "I know this wasn't what either of us planned, but it's happening. I just thought you should know." Jerome sat back in his chair, his mind racing. This wasn't real. This couldn't be happening. He wasn't ready to be a father. Not now. Not ever. His carefully crafted life, his freedom, everything he had worked to maintain. It was all slipping away, faster than he could comprehend. He looked at Maria, her face determined, her eyes bright with a mix of apprehension and something else, something that looked a lot like hope. And in that moment, Jerome realized that his life was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. The weight of consequences. Jerome sat in his car after leaving the cafe, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The world outside the windshield seemed to blur as his mind raced. The words Maria had spoken, "Am keeping the baby," echoed in his head like a bell ringing endlessly, each chime bringing more weight and anxiety crashing down on him. How had this happened? They had been so clear that night. No strings attached, no future obligations, just two consenting adults looking for a bit of fun. But now, everything was different. He leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes as he tried to gather his thoughts. His carefully constructed life, his freedom, his independence. It all felt like it was slipping away. In a matter of seconds, his world had been turned upside down. For the next several days, Jerome avoided responding to Maria's messages. He needed space. He needed time to process. His mind was in constant turmoil, flipping between anger, fear, and confusion. He would sit at his desk at work, trying to focus on spreadsheets and reports, but all he could think about was the gravity of the situation that loomed over him like a storm cloud. A baby. He wasn't ready for this. He wasn't even ready for a relationship, let alone fatherhood. Maria, however, wasn't waiting for him to catch up. Her messages were persistent, though never aggressive. She wanted to talk, to figure things out, but Jerome wasn't ready. He didn't know how to talk about something that felt so utterly out of his control. He wasn't equipped for this kind of responsibility, and he feared what the future might hold. One night, after ignoring yet another message from Maria, Jerome met up with his best friend, Marcus, at their usual bar. Marcus had known Jerome for years, through all of his ups and downs, and Jerome figured he was the only person who might help him make sense of this chaos. The bar was lively, as always, but Jerome was a bundle of nerves as they sat at their regular booth, sipping on cold beers. "You've been quiet, man," Marcus said, eyeing him with concern. "Something's up. What's going on?" Jerome smiled, his voice steady. "Nothing. Jerome took a deep breath, setting his beer down. "Maria's pregnant," he said, the words feeling foreign and heavy on his tongue. Marcus raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "Wait, Maria. That older woman you hooked up with a few months ago. You're serious?" Jerome nodded, his eyes fixed on the table. "Yeah, she's keeping the baby. I don't know what to do." For a moment, Marcus was silent, letting the news sink in. Then he let out a low whistle. "Damn, man. That's heavy. You didn't see this coming at all." "Not at all," Jerome said, running a hand through his hair. "We were on the same page, or at least I thought we were. It was supposed to be a one-time thing. Nothing serious. Now I'm going to be a father, and I don't even know how to feel about it." Marcus leaned back in his chair, taking a long sip of his beer. "That's a tough situation. But you have to figure out what you want, Jerome. You can't just ignore it and hope it goes away. She's keeping the baby, so whether you like it or not, this is happening." Jerome's stomach twisted at Marcus's words. He knew his friend was right, but it didn't make things any easier. "I'm not ready for this," Jerome admitted, his voice quieter. "I'm not ready to be tied down. I have a career, my life. I didn't plan for this." Marcus sighed. "Life doesn't care about plans, man. It just throws things at you, and you have to deal with them. But think about it. Are you going to run away from this, or are you going to face it and figure out what kind of man you want to be?" Jerome stayed quiet, mulling over Marcus's words. He wasn't the kind of guy to run from responsibility, but this felt different. It felt unfair, like a trap he hadn't seen coming. And yet, as much as he wanted to escape, he couldn't shake the feeling that running would only make things worse. His life might have changed in an instant, but ignoring it wouldn't stop the consequences from catching up to him. A few more days passed before Jerome finally gathered the courage to meet Maria again. She had suggested they meet at her apartment, the same place where their ill-fated night had begun. Jerome had avoided it for weeks, but now, as he stood outside her door, his heart racing, he knew there was no more running from this. Maria opened the door, looking surprised but relieved to see him. She didn't say anything at first, just stepped aside to let him in. The apartment looked the same, though now Jerome noticed small changes. Baby magazines scattered on the coffee table, a couple of parenting books stacked in the corner. It made his stomach twist. They sat on the couch, an awkward silence hanging between them before Maria finally spoke. "I didn't think you'd come," she said softly, her eyes searching his. Jerome sighed, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "I've been trying to figure things out. This is a lot, Maria. It's not what I expected, and I don't know what to do." Maria nodded, her face softening. "I understand. This isn't what I expected either, Jerome. But I've had time to think, and I know what I want. I want this baby. I know it's not ideal, and I know you're scared. But this is happening." Jerome swallowed hard, the reality of her words settling deep into his bones. He looked at her, at the determination in her eyes, and realized that while this might have been a surprise for both of them, Maria had already embraced the idea of motherhood. She wasn't backing down. "What does this mean for us?" Jerome asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never planned for this, and I don't even know if I'm ready to be a father." Maria sighed, her eyes softening. "I'm not asking you to be ready right this second, Jerome. But I need you to be honest with me. If you're not going to be involved, I need to know now. I can't raise this child with you being half in and half out. That's not fair to the baby, and it's not fair to either of us." Jerome felt the weight of her words settling in his chest. He had been so focused on how this situation affected him, how it had turned his life upside down, that he hadn't even considered the long-term implications. This wasn't just about his freedom or his career anymore. This was about a child, a life that was growing inside Maria. "I don't know what kind of father I'll be," Jerome admitted, his voice shaky. "But I don't want to walk away. I won't abandon my own child." Maria's expression softened, a glimmer of relief crossing her face. "That's all I needed to hear." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the future hanging heavily between them. For the first time since this all began, Jerome felt a small flicker of resolve growing inside him. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew he couldn't run from it anymore. In the weeks that followed, Jerome began to come to terms with his new reality. He met with Maria more frequently, and while their conversations were often difficult, they were necessary. They talked about the baby, about what role Jerome would play, about how they would navigate this unexpected situation. There was still tension between them. How could there not be? But slowly, they began to find a rhythm. One afternoon, Jerome accompanied Maria to her first ultrasound appointment. As he sat in the sterile room, watching the black and white image of the tiny life growing inside her, something shifted inside him. This was real. This wasn't just a problem to solve or a mistake to fix. This was a child, a part of him. As the doctor pointed out the faint heartbeat on the screen, Jerome felt an emotion he hadn't expected, something like awe. His life had changed, yes, but maybe, just maybe, it wasn't the end of the world. Maybe it was the beginning of something else. For the first time since this all began, Jerome allowed himself to consider the possibility that this could be more than just a burden. It could be a chance, an opportunity to grow, to become more than the man he had been. But the road ahead was long and uncertain, and Jerome knew that the hardest part was still yet to come. Navigating the unexpected. Jerome sat on his couch, staring blankly at the television, as the sound of a sports commentary drifted into the background. The last few weeks had felt like a whirlwind, a constant tug-of-war between his old life and the new one that was rapidly approaching. His mind was cluttered with thoughts he couldn't seem to shake. He had tried to immerse himself in his work, to lose himself in the familiar routine of spreadsheets, deadlines, and client meetings. But no matter what he did, his thoughts always came back to Maria and the baby. The ultrasound had been a turning point, a moment where the gravity of the situation fully sank in. Jerome had never considered himself the paternal type. He had been more focused on his career and enjoying his freedom than on settling down or starting a family. Yet, seeing that small flicker of life on the screen, hearing the soft beat of his child's heart, had stirred something inside him that he couldn't ignore. He wasn't ready, but ready or not, this was happening. He picked up his phone and scrolled through the messages from Maria. They had kept in touch regularly, mostly discussing the logistics of the pregnancy, doctor's appointments, planning for the baby, and how they would manage things moving forward. Their conversations were civil, even friendly at times, but there was an underlying tension. The dynamic between them had changed drastically since that first night they met. The playful banter, the lightness of their initial connection had been replaced by a sense of duty and responsibility. Jerome sighed, setting his phone aside. He had been avoiding the deeper questions: what kind of father he would be, how he would balance his life with this new responsibility, and whether he and Maria would ever truly find common ground beyond the child they were now bound to. He didn't want to think about it, didn't want to face the reality that everything was changing so quickly, but there was no escaping it anymore. One afternoon, Maria called and asked Jerome to meet her at a baby supply store. "I'm going to start buying some things for the nursery," she said over the phone, her voice steady, but with a hint of anticipation. "I figured it would be good for you to come along." Jerome hesitated. He wasn't ready for this, walking down aisles filled with baby cribs, strollers, diapers, and tiny clothes. It felt too real, too fast. But he also knew he couldn't keep avoiding the situation. If he was going to be involved, he needed to step up. When he arrived at the store, Maria was already there, browsing through a row of cribs. She looked different from the last time he had seen her, more visibly pregnant now, her belly rounded beneath a loose sweater. It was yet another reminder of how far things had progressed in such a short amount of time. "Hey," he said awkwardly as he approached her. Maria smiled, though there was a hint of uncertainty in her expression. "I'm glad you came." Jerome looked around, taking in the overwhelming array of baby products. "This is a lot," he admitted, feeling out of place in the brightly lit store. Everywhere he looked, there were signs of the life that was coming. Cribs, baby monitors, high chairs. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was in over his head. "I know," Maria said softly. "It's a lot for me too. But we have to start somewhere." They spent the next hour walking through the store, Maria explaining the different things they would need for the baby. She talked about car seats, diapers, bottles, and clothing sizes, while Jerome tried his best to keep up. He felt like he was drowning in information, each new item they discussed adding another layer to the weight already on his shoulders. As they reached the end of the store, they found themselves in front of a display of baby clothes, tiny onesies, socks, and hats in soft pastel colors. Maria picked up a pair of miniature baby booties and held them up, a small smile playing on her lips. "Can you believe it?" she said, her voice soft. "In a few months, we're going to have a baby wearing these." Jerome stared at the tiny booties, his heart tightening in his chest. It still didn't feel real, not entirely. But at the same time, it was becoming harder and harder to deny that this was his future now. "I know it's overwhelming," Maria continued, sensing his unease. "It's overwhelming for me too. But we're in this together. You don't have to do it alone." Jerome appreciated her words, but they didn't completely ease his anxiety. He had never imagined himself as a father, and now, here he was, preparing for a baby he hadn't planned for. The uncertainty of it all gnawed at him. What if he wasn't good at this? What if he let everyone down? Maria, the baby, even himself. They made their way to the checkout, and as they stood in line, Jerome finally voiced the question that had been haunting him for weeks. "Do you ever wonder how this is going to work between us?" he asked, glancing at Maria. "I mean, we weren't exactly planning on becoming parents together." Maria paused, her expression thoughtful. "I think about it all the time," she admitted. "We're in a unique situation, that's for sure. But I think we can figure it out if we stay honest with each other. I don't expect us to suddenly become a perfect family. We both have our lives, and we didn't plan for this. But we can still be good parents, even if it's complicated." Jerome nodded, though he still felt the uncertainty lingering. He didn't know how they would navigate this. Two people who had barely known each other before this life-changing event. But Maria's calm resolve gave him some comfort. She wasn't panicking, and maybe that was enough to keep him grounded for now. In the weeks that followed, Jerome tried to adjust to his new reality. He found himself slowly becoming more involved, attending more doctor's appointments with Maria, helping her set up the nursery, and even reading a few parenting books. Each step felt like a small victory, a reassurance that he wasn't completely out of his depth, though the doubts still lingered. His friends, particularly Marcus, were supportive, though their reactions varied. Some were shocked, some tried to lighten the mood with jokes, and others offered advice, despite being just as clueless about parenting as Jerome was. "Man, you're going to be a dad. That's wild," Marcus had said one evening over drinks. "I never thought I'd see the day." "Neither did I," Jerome had replied with a dry laugh. "But here we are." As Jerome tried to prepare himself for fatherhood, he also found himself thinking more about his relationship with Maria. It was complicated, to say the least. They were bound together by this baby, but what were they beyond that? They had never been in a relationship, not really, and now they were navigating uncharted territory. There were moments when Jerome felt a strange connection to Maria, like when they shared small victories in setting up the nursery, or when they laughed about how neither of them knew what half of the baby gadgets they were buying actually did. But there were also moments of tension, silent, uncomfortable moments where the weight of their situation pressed down on them both. Jerome could sense that Maria was still grappling with her own fears and uncertainties, even if she didn't show it as often. He wondered if she ever regretted her decision, if she ever questioned whether they could truly co-parent successfully given the circumstances. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, Jerome found himself sitting in the nursery he and Maria had put together. It was a small room, but they had made it cozy, with pale yellow walls and a crib that still smelled like fresh wood. Jerome sat in the rocking chair by the window, staring at the mobile they had hung above the crib, a soft melody playing as the tiny stars and moons spun in slow circles. He couldn't help but think about his own childhood. His father had left when he was young, leaving his mother to raise him and his siblings on her own. Jerome had always promised himself that if he ever had kids, he would be different. He wouldn't be the kind of man who walked away from his responsibilities. But now that he was here, on the cusp of fatherhood, he couldn't shake the fear that he might not be enough. Maria found him there, sitting in the dark nursery, lost in thought. She stood in the doorway for a moment before stepping inside, sitting on the edge of the crib. "You okay?" she asked gently. Jerome looked up at her, unsure of how to put his feelings into words. "I don't know," he admitted. "I'm scared, Maria. I don't know if I'm ready for this. What if I'm not good at it? What if I let everyone down?" Maria's expression softened, and she reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "You're not going to let anyone down," she said quietly. "I know this isn't what you planned, but you're here, and you're trying. That's what matters. We'll figure it out together." For the first time in weeks, Jerome felt a small sense of relief. Maybe Maria was right. Maybe the fact that he was here, that he was willing to try, was enough. The road ahead was still uncertain, and he knew there would be challenges. But in that moment, sitting in the quiet nursery with Maria by his side, he realized that he wasn't alone in this. They were in it together, for better or worse. And for now, that was enough. The reality of responsibility. Jerome woke up to the sound of rain tapping against his bedroom window. He lay in bed for a moment, staring at the ceiling, letting the rhythmic sound calm his racing thoughts. It had been months since Maria told him she was pregnant, and yet every morning he woke up with the same knot of anxiety in his stomach. The weight of responsibility was constant, heavy, and unrelenting. Today, though, felt different. Today, the reality of the situation was beginning to settle in, whether he liked it or not. The baby would be here soon, and everything would change. As he got ready for the day, Jerome couldn't shake the nagging thoughts that had been creeping into his mind more frequently. How was he going to balance his career with fatherhood? Would he have to put his dreams on hold? And what about Maria? Their relationship had always been undefined, but now that a baby was in the picture, it was impossible to ignore the tension that lingered between them. They had shared moments of connection, sure, but they were far from being in love. They were bound together by circumstance, not choice, and that reality weighed heavily on him. He headed to work, trying to lose himself in the familiar routine of the office. His colleagues were unaware of the storm brewing in his personal life, and Jerome preferred it that way. He wasn't ready to share his situation with anyone outside of his inner circle, least of all his boss, who had high expectations for him. Jerome had worked hard to get where he was, climbing the corporate ladder and earning a reputation as someone who could handle anything thrown his way. But this was different. By lunchtime, Jerome's mind was elsewhere. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he glanced down to see a message from Maria. It was a simple text, but it hit him like a ton of bricks. "Doctor's appointment today at 3. Can you make it?" He stared at the message for a long moment, his stomach twisting in knots. He had forgotten about the appointment. Another ultrasound, one that would give them a clearer picture of the baby's development. It was important, he knew that, but the thought of sitting in that sterile doctor's office again, facing the reality of fatherhood, was daunting. Jerome typed out a response, hesitating for a moment before hitting send. "Yeah, I'll be there." By the time Jerome arrived at the doctor's office, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and reflective under the afternoon sun. He parked his car and walked inside, feeling a familiar sense of unease settle in his chest. These appointments had become routine in the past few weeks, but they hadn't gotten any easier. Each one was a reminder that the baby was coming, that his life was changing in ways he still couldn't fully comprehend. Maria was already sitting in the waiting room when he arrived, flipping through a magazine. She looked up when she saw him, offering a small, tired smile. Her pregnancy was more obvious now, her belly a visible sign of the life growing inside her. Jerome couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. Maria was carrying so much of this burden on her own, and despite his best intentions, he still felt like he wasn't doing enough. "Hey," he said, sitting down next to her. "How are you feeling?" Maria shrugged. "Tired, mostly. The baby's been kicking a lot more these days." Jerome nodded, unsure of what to say. He still found it surreal, the idea that there was a baby, his baby, inside her. "That's a good sign, right?" "Yeah," Maria replied, her voice soft. "It means everything's going well so far." They sat in silence for a few minutes, the awkwardness between them palpable. It wasn't that they didn't get along, on the contrary. They had learned how to navigate each other's company over the past few months. But there was an unspoken tension between them, a sense that neither of them knew what the future would hold. A nurse called Maria's name, and they both stood up, following her into the exam room. Jerome had been through this routine enough times to know what to expect. The doctor would come in, they'd do the ultrasound, and then they'd sit and listen as she explained the baby's progress. But today felt different. There was a weight in the air, a sense that this appointment was more significant than the others. The doctor entered the room, a kind smile on her face as she greeted them. "How are we feeling today?" she asked, directing her question at Maria. "Tired, but good," Maria replied. "The baby's been active lately." "That's great to hear," the doctor said, preparing the ultrasound machine. "Let's take a look and see how things are going." Jerome stood next to Maria as she lay back on the exam table, the doctor applying the cool gel to her belly before pressing the ultrasound wand against her skin. The screen lit up with the familiar black and white image, and Jerome's heart raced as he watched the baby's tiny form come into focus. "There we go," the doctor said, pointing to the screen. "Everything looks good. The baby's growing right on schedule." Jerome stared at the screen, mesmerized by the sight of the tiny life inside Maria. It was surreal, watching the baby move, its little arms and legs twitching as it floated in the womb. For a moment, all of his fears and doubts faded away, replaced by a strange sense of awe. That's our baby," he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. Maria glanced up at him, her expression softening. "Yeah, it is." The doctor continued with the exam, explaining the baby's progress and answering their questions. But Jerome barely heard her. His mind was racing, caught between the reality of what he was seeing and the uncertainty of what it all meant. He was going to be a father. That fact, as undeniable as it was, still felt like something out of a dream, something that didn't quite belong to him yet. After the appointment, Jerome and Maria walked out of the clinic together. The sun had broken through the clouds, casting a warm glow over the streets as they made their way to the parking lot. Jerome's mind was still reeling from the ultrasound, the image of the baby etched into his memory. Maria broke the silence as they reached their cars. "You seem different today," she said, her voice gentle. "More, I don't know, present." Jerome stopped and turned to face her, frowning slightly. "What do you mean?" Maria shrugged, looking a little uncertain herself. "I don't know. It just felt like, for the first time, you were really there with me. Like you're starting to get it." Jerome let her words sink in. He had been trying, really trying, to be present, to be involved. But it was hard. Every step felt like a reminder of how unprepared he was, how little he knew about being a father, about being a partner to Maria in this new, complicated way. Still, she was right. Something had shifted during the ultrasound. He had felt a connection to the baby, a flicker of something deeper than the fear and uncertainty that had been holding him back. "I guess I am starting to get it," Jerome admitted, leaning against his car. It's a lot, Maria. I'm still trying to wrap my head around all of this. Maria nodded, her expression softening. I know. It's a lot for me too. But we'll figure it out. We don't have a choice. Jerome looked at her, taking in the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her shoulders slumped ever so slightly under the weight of the pregnancy. She had been strong through all of this, stronger than him, in a lot of ways. But he could see the cracks, the moments where the strain was starting to show. I don't want you to feel like you're doing this alone, Jerome said, his voice quiet but firm. I know I haven't been the best at showing up, but I'm trying. I'm not going to let you down. Maria smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. I know you're trying, Jerome, and I appreciate it. But it's hard for both of us. We're figuring this out as we go. They stood there for a moment, the weight of the conversation hanging between them. Jerome knew there were no easy answers, no magic solution that would make everything feel okay. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was beginning to understand what it meant to be in this with Maria, to share the burden, to be a part of this journey, even when it was hard. Look, I know this isn't how either of us imagined things would go, Jerome said, running a hand through his hair, but I want to be there. For you, and for the baby. I don't want to mess this up. Maria looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, she reached out and placed a hand on his arm, her touch light but grounding. We won't mess this up, she said softly. We're in this together, Jerome, and that's what matters. As they stood there, side by side in the parking lot, Jerome felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. The road ahead was still uncertain, filled with challenges he couldn't yet predict. But for the first time since this journey had begun, he felt like he wasn't facing it alone. They were in this together, and maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. Later that evening, Jerome found himself sitting on his couch, staring at the ultrasound photo Maria had given him. The tiny, blurry image of the baby was a reminder of everything that was about to change. He couldn't help but feel overwhelmed by the enormity of it all. Fatherhood, co-parenting with Maria, balancing his career and his personal life. It was more than he had ever bargained for. But as he stared at the photo, a new thought began to take root in his mind. Maybe this wasn't about what he had bargained for. Maybe it wasn't about what he had planned or expected. Maybe it was about stepping up, taking responsibility, and embracing the unexpected. For so long, Jerome had been focused on what he might lose, his freedom, his career, his sense of control over his life. But now he was beginning to see things differently. Maybe, just maybe, there was something to gain in all of this, something deeper and more meaningful than he had ever imagined. As the evening wore on, Jerome felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. The fear and uncertainty were still there, lurking beneath the surface, but they were tempered by something new, a quiet resolve to face whatever came next, no matter how difficult it might be. For the first time in a long time, Jerome felt ready to take on the responsibility of fatherhood, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Facing the consequences, the days following the ultrasound brought Jerome an unusual sense of calm, as if the storm that had been raging inside him for months had finally subsided. Yet, as much as he was coming to terms with the idea of fatherhood, there was still a lingering unease, a sense that the hardest part of this journey had yet to come. The reality of the baby was undeniable now. Maria's belly was growing larger with each passing week, and the timeline for the birth was growing shorter. Soon, everything would change, and Jerome knew that the responsibilities he had been dreading would become very real. But even with this newfound sense of commitment, the question of how he would manage everything continued to weigh on him. At work, Jerome's focus had begun to slip. His productivity was down, and he found it difficult to juggle the demands of his job with the emotional and practical demands of preparing for a baby. The people around him were starting to notice the change. His boss, Eric, had pulled him aside more than once, asking if everything was okay. Jerome had brushed it off, giving vague answers about personal issues, but he knew it wouldn't be long before his lack of focus started affecting his career in more tangible ways. One afternoon, while Jerome was sitting at his desk, staring blankly at his computer screen, his phone buzzed with a text from Maria. "We need to talk. Can you come over tonight?" Jerome stared at the message for a long time, his heart sinking. In the past, those 4 words had never meant anything good, and he had a feeling this time would be no different. Despite the progress they had made in trying to navigate this new phase of their lives, there was still an underlying tension between them, something that hadn't yet been addressed, and something he feared could tear them apart before they had even really begun. He typed a quick response, "I'll be there at 7. When Jerome arrived at Maria's apartment that evening, the air between them felt heavy. She opened the door with a small, tired smile, but there was something in her eyes, an uneasiness that mirrored his own. They sat down in the living room, the silence between them growing uncomfortable as the minutes ticked by. Jerome was the first to break the quiet. "What's going on, Maria?" Maria hesitated, folding her hands in her lap. She stared down at them for a moment, as if gathering her thoughts, before finally speaking. "I've been thinking a lot about the baby. About us." Jerome felt a knot form in his stomach. He had been dreading this conversation, knowing it was inevitable, but hoping they could avoid it for just a little longer. "I know this has been hard on both of us," Maria continued, her voice soft but steady. "And I know you've been trying. I see that. But I've been doing a lot of thinking about what happens after the baby is born, about what we're going to do." Jerome nodded slowly, bracing himself for what was coming next. "I've been thinking about that too." Maria looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resolve. "I don't think we can keep pretending this is something it's not. We're not together, Jerome. We never were. And I don't think it's fair to either of us, or the baby, to try to force something that isn't there." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut, but Jerome couldn't deny the truth in them. He had been trying to convince himself that maybe, with time, things could change between them. That maybe they could be more than just co-parents. But deep down, he had known from the start that their connection wasn't built to last. It had always been temporary, a moment in time that had spiraled into something neither of them had expected or planned for. "I get it," Jerome said quietly, his voice barely audible. "I've been thinking the same thing." Maria looked relieved but also heartbroken. "I don't want us to be at odds, Jerome. I want us to be on the same page, especially for the baby's sake. But I don't think we should pretend that we're something we're not. I think we need to focus on co-parenting, on making sure we're both there for our child in the best way we can be." Jerome nodded, his heart heavy. He had known this was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. He had grown accustomed to the idea of Maria being in his life, even if it wasn't in the way he had originally imagined. Now the thought of them being connected only by the baby felt empty, like a chapter of his life was closing before it had even really begun. "I agree," Jerome said, his voice steady but tinged with sadness. "I don't want to make things harder than they need to be. We should focus on what's best for the baby. That's what matters." For a moment, they sat in silence, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Jerome's mind was racing, trying to process the shift in their relationship. It was clear now that whatever future he had imagined with Maria wasn't going to happen. They were bound together by their child, but that was the extent of their connection. It was a sobering realization, one that left him feeling adrift. But there was something else beneath the surface, something that had been gnawing at Jerome for weeks, the nagging sense that he hadn't been told the full story about how they had ended up in this situation. "Maria," Jerome said, breaking the silence, "there's something I've been meaning to ask you, and I need you to be honest with me." Maria's brow furrowed, her eyes flickering with concern. "What is it?" Jerome hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "The night this all happened, when we were together, did you plan this?" Maria's eyes widened in shock, and for a moment, the room felt impossibly still. She stared at him, her face a mixture of surprise and hurt. "Jerome, are you asking me if I trapped you into getting me pregnant?" Jerome shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He hadn't meant to be so blunt, but the question had been weighing on him for too long. I need to know. We were always careful before. And that night, something felt different. I've been trying to make sense of it, and I can't help but wonder if... "Stop," Maria interrupted, her voice shaking with anger. "You think I did this on purpose? That I manipulated you into this?" Jerome felt a pang of guilt, but he pressed on. "I don't know, Maria. I'm just trying to understand how we ended up here." Maria stood up, her face flushed with emotion. "I would never do that to you. Never. I didn't plan this, Jerome. It just happened. And I've been dealing with the consequences ever since, just like you." Jerome stood up as well, his frustration boiling over. "But you wanted this baby, didn't you? From the moment you found out, you were all in. You didn't even consider what I wanted." Maria's eyes flashed with hurt. "Because I thought it was the right thing to do. I thought we could figure it out together. I never once tried to trap you. This wasn't some plan to ruin your life, Jerome." Jerome's anger deflated as quickly as it had risen, leaving him feeling hollow. He hadn't meant to accuse her, not really. But the fear, the confusion, and the overwhelming sense of helplessness had been building for so long that he didn't know where else to direct it. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I've been scared. I don't know how to do this." Maria's expression softened, though the hurt lingered in her eyes. "I know. I've been scared too. But accusing me of something like that, it's not fair, Jerome." "I know," Jerome said again, feeling the wave of regret wash over him. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you." Maria sighed, sitting back down on the couch. "This is hard enough as it is. We don't need to make it harder by tearing each other apart. We're going to be parents, Jerome. We need to be on the same team." Jerome nodded, sinking down into the seat beside her. "You're right. We need to figure this out, together." For a long moment, they sat in silence, the weight of the conversation hanging between them. The accusations, the fears, the misunderstandings, it all felt like too much, too overwhelming. But beneath it all, there was a shared resolve. They both knew what was at stake, and they both understood that, no matter what had happened in the past, they had to find a way forward. "We'll figure it out," Maria said softly, her voice tinged with exhaustion. "For the baby." Jerome nodded. "For the baby." As they sat there, side by side but worlds apart, Jerome realized that the path ahead would be more challenging than he had ever imagined. There were no easy answers, no simple solutions. But one thing was clear. They had to find a way to navigate this new reality, to face the consequences of their choices, and to build a future for their child, no matter how difficult it might be. The new reality. The weeks following Jerome and Maria's difficult conversation were filled with an odd sense of quiet. It wasn't the kind of peace that brought comfort, but rather the eerie calm before a storm, a stillness where everything seemed balanced on a knife's edge. Both Jerome and Maria had come to a fragile agreement about co-parenting, but the path ahead was anything but clear. The baby's due date loomed closer with each passing day, and Jerome could feel the weight of it settling on his shoulders like a boulder. The sense of urgency gripped him tighter with every ticking second, and the once distant idea of becoming a father was now a reality that demanded his full attention. For months, it had felt as though the baby was a distant possibility, but now it was happening, whether he was ready or not. The final days of Maria's pregnancy passed in a blur of doctor's appointments, phone calls, and hurried preparations. Jerome had taken time off from work to be fully available when the baby arrived, but in truth, he had no idea what he was supposed to do with himself in the meantime. His apartment, which had always been his sanctuary of solitude, now felt suffocating. The walls seemed to close in on him, and his thoughts churned endlessly in circles, filled with both hope and dread for what was about to come. One evening, just a week before Maria's due date, Jerome received a frantic phone call from her. She sounded breathless, her words tumbling out in a rush. "Jerome, it's happening. I think my water just broke." Jerome froze, his heart hammering in his chest. For months, he had mentally prepared for this moment, but now that it was here, his mind went blank. He barely managed to stammer out a reply. "Oh, okay, I'm coming over. We'll get to the hospital." Fumbling to grab his keys and coat, Jerome rushed out of his apartment, barely locking the door behind him. The drive to Maria's place felt like an eternity, even though it was only a few miles away. His thoughts raced uncontrollably. What if something goes wrong? What if I'm not ready for this? But he pushed them down, trying to focus on the immediate task at hand. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about the baby and Maria. When he arrived at her apartment, Maria was already waiting by the door, clutching her hospital bag and leaning heavily against the frame. She looked pale, a sheen of sweat on her forehead. But her expression was resolute. "Let's go," she said, her voice tight with pain. Jerome quickly helped her into the car, and they sped toward the hospital, the air between them thick with tension. The silence was punctuated only by Maria's sharp breaths as she tried to manage the pain. Jerome's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. When they arrived at the hospital, everything moved in a blur of activity. Nurses whisked Maria away to a delivery room, and Jerome found himself standing awkwardly in the hallway, unsure of where he was supposed to be. He felt utterly out of place, like an intruder in this sacred, terrifying moment. But then Maria's voice called out from the room, "Jerome, come in here." He hesitated for only a second before stepping inside. The room was sterile, filled with the low hum of machines and the sharp scent of antiseptic. Maria lay on the bed, her face contorted with pain, but she looked at Jerome with an intensity that cut through the chaos around them. "Stay with me," she whispered, reaching out a trembling hand. Jerome swallowed hard and took her hand, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure what he could offer her in that moment. He wasn't a doctor, he wasn't a partner, and he certainly wasn't an expert on childbirth, but he knew that he couldn't leave her to face this alone. The hours that followed were some of the longest and most harrowing of Jerome's life. He had never seen anyone in so much pain, and watching Maria go through labor was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. He held her hand through every contraction, whispered words of encouragement when she seemed on the verge of giving up, and tried his best to remain calm even though he felt like he was barely holding himself together. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the baby was born. A tiny, piercing cry filled the room, and Jerome's breath caught in his throat as the nurse handed the newborn to Maria. She cradled the baby in her arms, her exhaustion melting away in the glow of new motherhood. Tears streamed down her face as she looked at their child, a perfect, tiny girl with wide, curious eyes. Jerome stood frozen at the edge of the bed, staring down at the baby in disbelief. It was as though time had stopped, and all the noise, all the fear, all the confusion faded into the background. In that moment, nothing else existed but the three of them. "Do you want to hold her?" Maria asked softly, her voice hoarse from the effort of labor. Jerome hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure if he was ready for this, for the weight of it all. But when Maria gently handed the baby to him, he felt something shift inside him. As he held his daughter for the first time, a wave of emotions crashed over him. Love, fear, hope, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility. She was so small, so fragile, but as she blinked up at him with those wide, innocent eyes, Jerome felt something click into place. This was his daughter, his child. And no matter how terrified he was, no matter how unprepared he felt, he knew that he would do whatever it took to protect her, to love her, to be the father she deserved. "Hi there," Jerome whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm your dad." Tears stung his eyes as he looked down at his daughter, her tiny fingers curling around his thumb. It was in that moment, holding her in his arms, that Jerome finally understood everything that had led him to this point. The fear, the uncertainty, the anger, the confusion, none of it mattered anymore. What mattered was her. Over the next few days, Jerome and Maria navigated the whirlwind of new parenthood together. There were sleepless nights, countless diaper changes, and moments of pure exhaustion, but through it all, Jerome found himself growing more and more attached to his daughter. Every time he looked at her, he felt that same surge of love and protectiveness, and he knew that no matter what happened between him and Maria, he would always be there for his little girl. Maria, too, seemed to soften in the days after the birth. The tension that had once existed between them eased as they settled into their new roles as co-parents. There were still moments of awkwardness, still lingering feelings that hadn't been fully resolved, but they were united in their love for their child. One afternoon, as Jerome sat by the window in Maria's apartment, cradling the baby in his arms, Maria approached him quietly. She looked tired, but there was a new warmth in her eyes, an understanding that hadn't been there before. "You're a good dad, Jerome," she said softly. Jerome glanced up, surprised by the unexpected compliment. "I'm trying," he replied, his voice modest. "I'm still figuring it out." Maria smiled, sitting down beside him. "We both are, but I think we're doing okay." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching as the baby slept peacefully in Jerome's arms. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was no tension, no unspoken resentment between them, just a shared sense of responsibility and love for their daughter. "I think we'll be all right," Jerome said quietly, more to himself than to Maria. Maria nodded, her eyes soft as she looked at him. "Yeah, I think so too." As the days turned into weeks, Jerome and Maria began to establish a new routine. They worked together to care for their daughter, trading off nights and duties, and slowly learning how to navigate this new chapter of their lives. It wasn't easy. There were still moments of frustration, still disagreements and misunderstandings, but they were both committed to making it work. Jerome knew that their relationship would never be what he had once hoped for. They weren't a couple, and they never would be. But they were something more than just two people bound by circumstance. They were parents, and that bond was unbreakable. In time, Jerome realized that his fear of fatherhood had been rooted not in the responsibility itself, but in his fear of failing. He had been afraid that he wouldn't be good enough, that he would somehow fall short. But holding his daughter in his arms, watching her grow and change each day, he knew that he would never stop trying. He would always be there for her, through every challenge, every joy, every moment of her life. This was his new reality. And for the first time, Jerome was okay with that. More than okay, he was ready. As he looked down at his daughter, her tiny hand wrapped around his finger, Jerome smiled. "I've got you," he whispered. "I've always got you." And in that moment, everything felt exactly as it should be.